Hey guys, tonight we drift back thousands of years, into the torchlit shadows of Egypt's midnight palaces. Imagine slipping into those endless halls of limestone and polished stone, the ceilings painted with stars that seem to flicker only when the torchlight hits them just right. The silence is broken by a faint crackle, flames licking against bundles of reeds soaked in animal fat. You squint, and there they are, the forgotten servants of light, the torchbearers. Their job was to guide, to protect, and if you think about it, to prevent every noble from smashing his face into a column. You probably won't survive this one, honestly. The smoke alone would choke you in minutes, not to mention the molten wax splatters. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the little map our community makes together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand barefoot on cool stone, a guest in the royal corridors of Egypt. The torchbearers pad along beside you, their shoulders hunched, their arms stiff from gripping long poles bound with reeds, resin, and animal fat. You watch one servant pause, lowering the torch to relight another that had sputtered out. The flame flares, lighting up a painted wall of Horus in hawk form, his wings stretched across eternity. The torchbearer's eyes don't linger on the art. He's not here for culture, only for survival. His job is to keep light between powerful men and the creeping dark, to chase shadows back into corners before they get ideas. The air smells of singed hair, resin smoke, and sweat. The servants aren't glamorous. Their linen kilts are patched, their chests bare, streaked with soot and ash. They're more like human lampstands than people, and yet everyone depends on them. The viziers striding past in jeweled collars wouldn't notice a single one unless the flame went out, and then, suddenly, that faceless torchbearer would become the most important man in the room. You follow them deeper, past a sleeping chamber where a guard yawns at his post. Torchlight trembles across the guard's copper spearhead. Without the flame, the metal would vanish into the dark, and so would any hope of spotting a would-be assassin sneaking in. That's the hidden truth. Torchbearers weren't just illumination, they were early security systems, bodyguards in disguise. A palace with no light was a palace ready for betrayal. One torchbearer pauses to scratch his soot-streaked cheek. He's young, maybe 13, and his hands already show burns. These servants started early, children trained to handle fire safely enough not to torch the drapery. Think of them as interns in Egypt's most dangerous internship program. You glance at his arms. One is scarred from a drop of molten resin. And yet he keeps going, because in Egypt, fire meant power. Historians still argue whether these torchbearers were chosen from servant households permanently or rotated like duty shifts. Some suggest entire families specialized in fire handling, passing the tricks of flame management down like recipes. Others think they were low-ranked palace kids, the kind of youngsters too clumsy to grind grain, but still good enough to hold a stick and walk straight. A quirky tidbit: Egyptians believed fire had both protective and destructive qualities. Carrying it through sacred halls wasn't just illumination, it was a spiritual defense. The torch's flames scared away snakes, both real and magical. You can almost hear the whispered superstitions: don't let the torch go out in a royal chamber, or evil spirits will slide right in with the darkness. You picture yourself holding one of those torches. The heat radiates against your face, drying your eyes. Your arms ache within minutes. Every step you take, hot resin drips dangerously close to your skin. Drop the torch, and you're in trouble. Not just from the flames licking the floor mats but from the nobles who will see you as an omen of doom. Joke's on you, one mistake, and you're not just fired, you're fired. In one chamber, the servants stand perfectly still, torches held like upright spears, while nobles feast at a midnight banquet. The torches create a shimmering halo over plates of roast goose and honey cakes. Musicians pluck harps, their notes bending under the smoke-thick air. The servants' eyes water, but they dare not move. You realize, these people are performing a human chandelier act. They were the silent backdrop to every royal photo op, except, of course, photography wouldn't exist for a few thousand years. Later, when the feast is done, the nobles stumble off, bellies full. The torchbearers remain. They guide tipsy dignitaries down corridors so no one trips on their own sandals. Imagine being the ancient equivalent of Uber headlights. That's the vibe. You're never thanked, always needed, and gone the moment the sun rises. Speaking of sunrise, there's the other cruel twist. Torchbearers worked through the night and had to vanish before dawn. Why? Because once the sun god, crossed the horizon, fire wasn't needed. Their existence was erased by daylight, like shadows folding back into walls. By the time nobles stretched awake, these servants were probably collapsed in some side chamber, reeking of smoke, their throats raw from breathing fumes all night. A mainstream historical fact to keep us grounded. Actual evidence of torch use comes from tomb paintings and archaeological finds of resin-soaked bundles. The depictions show attendants holding flames in temple scenes, hinting at their very real role in ritual and daily life. And yet, here's where the debate sharpens. Some scholars argue that much of the lighting at night was done by oil lamps, not handheld torches. Lamps were steadier, less smoky, and easier to control. But the counter-argument insists torches were more mobile, perfect for corridors and processions. Maybe it wasn't either/or. Maybe the torchbearers were simply the flex crew, bridging the gap between fixed lamps and total darkness. You catch yourself leaning against a painted wall as the procession moves on. The scene becomes hypnotic, torchlight dancing over hieroglyphs, casting long-limbed shadows of gods across the plaster. For a moment, you're convinced the deities are moving, shifting under the flicker, watching you. That's part of the magic, right? Light isn't just light, it's drama. Every ritual, every royal appearance was staged like a theater production, and torchbearers were the lighting crew. There's an almost comic moment when one servant sneezes, sending sparks flying dangerously close to a noble's beard. A quick slap on the torch and the danger's gone, but you feel the tension, the kind of "don't get me fired" panic that transcends centuries. Somewhere in the future, a stagehand will drop a spotlight at a rock concert, and the same embarrassed shrug will echo this moment. And what about those long processions, when the pharaoh emerged like a star on tour? You imagine torchbearers lining the path, fire and rhythm like glowing metronomes, setting the beat for drums and chants. The spectacle wasn't just for the gods, it was for the people too, proof that the ruler commanded not only armies but the very element of fire. Night deepens. The palace quiets. The torches burn low, spitting and hissing. A servant leans one against the wall, scrapes resin off to feed the flame again, and mutters a prayer under his breath. You stand there, smelling the acrid smoke, realizing you've stepped into a life no one ever wrote songs about. They didn't get tombs with murals. No golden masks, no scrolls of fame. But without them, half of Egypt's nighttime would have been blind. And just like that, the torches lead you out into a courtyard, where the stars blaze with their own fire. The servants scatter, disappearing into small side doors, their duty done until the next sunset. The silence is heavy, but it isn't empty. It hums with the echo of flames, the unseen labor that kept the night alive. You slip out of the echoing corridors and into the heavier air of the palace backyards, where the grand columns end and the smell of yeast and damp grain begins. The torchbearers vanish into sleep, and now you find yourself among the beer brewers, the quiet backbone of Egyptian life. You hear bubbling vats, smell fermenting barley, and realize quickly that if you don't like the scent of sour bread, you're going to struggle. This is not a fine winery. This is thick, cloudy beer, the lifeblood of Egypt, and the servants brewing it weren't seen as artisans of luxury. They were assembly line workers of necessity. The courtyard is low-walled, open to the night sky. Fires crackle beneath clay vats, and servants stir them with long paddles, each movement slow and repetitive. Steam rises in waves, coating their hair with dampness. You watch one servant lean over the rim to check consistency, nearly falling in. The smell of roasted grain and faint sweetness hits you like warm bread mixed with vinegar. For Egyptians, this was normal. For you, it's like walking through a bakery that also moonlights as a brewery. Beer wasn't a luxury, It was as common as water, sometimes safer than water. Everyone drank it: nobles, priests, laborers, even kids. Forget champagne towers. Imagine children sipping what was basically liquid porridge. Joke's on you if you're imagining a frothy pint glass. This stuff was more like soup, sipped with straws to avoid chunks floating on top. The servants stirring the vats are covered in sweat and grain dust. Their muscles ache from the endless repetition, but they keep going, because a palace without beer is like Netflix without Wi-Fi, completely useless. Beer kept workers fueled for temple building, pyramid hauling, and even late-night rituals. Without it, the machine of Egypt would sputter. You crouch closer. One servant takes baked loaves, deliberately undercooked, half raw, and crumbles them into a vat. That's the trick. Bread was brewed into beer. The yeast already present in the half-baked loaves kickstarted fermentation. Historians still argue whether this method produced something strong or just mildly buzzworthy. Some say it barely got you tipsy. Others think Egypt's beer packed enough punch to make even Ra's solar boat wobble. A quirky tidbit: archaeologists found tiny straws made of reeds, sometimes decorated, used for sipping beer straight from jars. Not for style points, but for survival. Without straws, you'd choke on grain husks and maybe a wandering beetle or two. Ancient Egypt, the original eco-straw movement. The brewers here aren't high-ranking servants. They live close to the mud, literally. Many were women, often tied to temple households, their work passed down generation after generation. You spot a girl no older than 12 kneading dough with her elbows, because her hands are too tired to press anymore. Beside her, an older woman stirs a pot, muttering something about Ra blessing the East. Religion and beer were tangled, offerings of beer jars piled up at temples, proof that the gods, too, wanted a good drink. You imagine the chaos of distribution. A scribe arrives, checking tallies on a clay tablet. Every jar must be accounted for, because this isn't just beer, it's wages. Workers on royal projects were paid in rations of bread and beer. No beer? No work. It's the closest thing to a paycheck you're going to get in a world without banks. By now, the courtyard hums like a sleepy factory. Servants lift jars, plug them with reed stoppers, and smear mud over the tops to seal them. A cat prowls by, pawing at spilled grain. Cats love breweries. It was free rodent patrol and free entertainment watching mice try and fail to steal from humans. You laugh quietly. Same setup as a modern brewery with a cat mascot, except these cats were semi-divine. Imagine explaining to your boss that your cat is technically a goddess, so she gets unlimited free samples. A mainstream historical fact: jars of beer were among the most common offerings found in tombs, right alongside bread and meat. Archaeologists even recreated recipes based on residue in ancient containers. The result? A cloudy, thick, bread-like beverage. One brave modern experimenter described it as liquid banana bread with vinegar. Let's just say Budweiser probably doesn't feel threatened. You notice how the servants organize themselves. Some handle fire, some stir, some bake the starter loaves, and some seal jars. It's an assembly line centuries before factories. The rhythm is hypnotic: the slap of dough, the scrape of paddles, the hiss of steam. Your ears start to tune it like a lullaby. But not everything is so mechanical. One brewer leans down, whispering a little prayer as she stirs. Beer was sacred, tied to the goddess Hathor, lady of drunkenness. Festivals in her honor involved drinking until you literally passed out. Historians still argue whether the point was joy, religious ecstasy, or just communal bonding with hangovers as divine punishment. Whatever the reason, the servants you see now are fueling something larger than themselves. They're brewing both wages and worship. A quirky story floats through your mind. In one myth, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war, nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. To stop her, the gods brewed vats of beer dyed red to look like blood. Sekhmet drank so much she passed out, saving humankind. So yes, beer once literally saved the world. Next time someone calls your pint unnecessary, remind them it prevented the apocalypse. Your feet stick in the grain-dusted mud as you follow a servant carrying 2 heavy jars towards storage. His back strains, his hands red from rope handles. He stumbles, nearly dropping one, and you can see the terror in his eyes. Breaking a jar isn't just clumsy, it's lost wages, lost offerings, maybe even lashes from an overseer. These servants lived in the tension between ordinary labor and divine expectation. Imagine making coffee at Starbucks, except if you spill a cup, a priest tells you you've doomed the afterlife. The night drags. Fires glow lower. Servants slump against walls, their clothes stiff with dried grain paste. Still, the vats bubble on, because fermentation doesn't sleep. Beer takes days, and someone has to check it constantly. You realize these servants aren't just workers, they're caretakers of living liquid. Yeast is alive, bubbling, unpredictable. Too hot, too cold, and everything spoils. Their job isn't brute force, it's babysitting millions of invisible organisms. One servant yawns, resting his head against a warm clay jar. His eyes flutter shut, and for a moment you wonder if he dreams of feasts where he can actually drink freely. Because here's the truth, most of this beer isn't for them. They might sneak a taste, lick the foam, or gulp the leftovers, but the bulk flows upward, to nobles, priests, workers higher in the pyramid of power. The brewers themselves, ironically, are often thirsty. Still, their work lingers in every corner of Egyptian culture. You recall how earlier torchbearers held fire for nobles' banquets. Guess what they were serving at those feasts? Yep, beer. You see how the web of servants intertwines, each forgotten role fueling the other. Beer fills cups, beer fills wages, beer fills myths. And the ones stirring the vats never get their names written on stone walls, yet without them, no torchlit banquet would sparkle, no tomb would overflow with offerings. The stars above pale toward dawn, and the courtyard slowly dims. Fires are banked, vats covered. Servants stretch, rubbing their aching arms. The smell of yeast lingers, clinging to your hair and clothes like smoke. As the first light of Are brushes the horizon, the brewers retreat into small huts by the river, leaving the jars stacked like silent soldiers, ready to march into history. You shuffle from the yeast-sweet courtyards into a space that feels both sacred and strangely mundane, the wide temple forecourts where sand sifters move in the dim glow of dawn. The first sunbeams scrape across pylons carved with gods, and yet your eyes are pulled downward, to the bent backs of servants who sift and sweep, sifting again, always ensuring the ground beneath priestly sandals is smooth enough to honor deities. Imagine janitorial duty, but with divine consequences. The sand crunches under your bare feet until one servant motions you aside. He pours sand through a woven reed screen, letting the finer grains slip down, discarding stones and debris. The sound is like a soft rain. Another sweeps the rejected chunks into baskets, carting them away. Their goal is simple: keep the temple floors level, clear, and spotless. But in a world where every grain symbolized chaos or order, that task carried cosmic weight. The air smells of dust and incense. A priest passes by, barely glancing at the workers, his linen robe crisp and clean because someone else just beat the floor into obedience. You realize these men and women are invisible until the moment they fail. If a priest trips over a stone, the sifter's back pays the price. It's like being tech support in the background. No one thanks you until Wi-Fi collapses, then suddenly you're the villain. Historians still argue whether these sandkeepers were official temple staff or lower-class laborers borrowed from estates. Some records suggest temples had entire, floor crews, responsible for daily cleansing, while others think they were seasonal hires, dragged in whenever festivals demanded extra tidiness. Either way, their anonymity is striking. They left no grand tombs, only worn reed sieves and brooms. A mainstream historical fact: temple courtyards were often resurfaced with new sand, layer upon layer, symbolic of renewal. Archaeologists have found floors packed with carefully sifted, imported sand, sometimes brought all the way from desert dunes rather than using whatever was underfoot locally. That's like importing beach sand to keep your cathedral spotless, costly, obsessive, and telling of how much they cared. You crouch beside one young boy working the sieve. His arms tremble as he shakes it rhythmically, dust coating his face until he looks like a statue himself. He doesn't complain. Instead, he hums under his breath, a little tune drowned out by the scrape of reeds. It dawns on you that these people created their own music out of monotony. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your mind. Some festival texts describe servants sweeping in choreographed rhythm, turning cleaning into ritual dance. Imagine temple janitors unintentionally inventing the first TikTok trend, except their audience was gods, not smartphones. The work itself borders on absurd. They remove not just rocks but animal droppings, wilted flower garlands left from offerings, even tiny beetles that scurry in. To modern eyes, it looks like endless futility. Within minutes, wind scatters fresh grit across the floor. But to Egyptians, this endless cleaning wasn't futility, it was a metaphor. Order, Ma'at, must always push back chaos, Isfit. By sifting sand, these servants weren't just cleaning, they were reenacting creation itself, grain by grain. You follow a pair of workers as they carry baskets to the Nile edge. They dump coarse gravel into the river, letting water claim what wasn't pure enough for temple use. The splash is small, but it feels ceremonial. Maybe they whispered thanks. Maybe they cursed the weight. You'll never know, because history didn't record their voices, only their labor. There's humor here too. One older worker waves a hand at the rising sun, muttering that he wishes RA would invent self-cleaning sand. Another smacks a fly so hard his sieve tips over, spilling perfectly sorted grains back onto the ground. The look on his face? Pure despair, the ancient equivalent of accidentally deleting a folder you spent all night sorting. Sweat streaks their bodies, drying into pale salt crusts. Dust mixes with tears, creating little mud rivulets down their cheeks. Yet they keep moving, because priests demand spotless courtyards before rituals begin. You picture processions of dancers and incense bearers gliding across the sand moments later, their movements effortless only because servants labored unseen before dawn. A quirky fringe theory sometimes pops up. Some Egyptologists speculate that sifted sand wasn't just about cleanliness but about acoustics. A freshly leveled courtyard might crunch differently under sandal, enhancing the rhythmic sound of ritual marches. Was that intentional, or just a byproduct? Historians still argue whether temple architects actually planned for soundscapes, or if that's modern overthinking. Either way, you can almost hear it, a crisp, unified crunch as dozens of feet hit purified sand in time. The boy beside you pauses, wiping his brow with a rag so filthy it only smears more dirt. He glances up at towering statues of Horus and mutters something you can't catch. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's sarcasm. Hard to blame him. Spend your life sweeping sand and see how long before you develop opinions about cosmic order. By midday, the sun roasts the courtyard, heat shimmering across carved walls. The sifters retreat briefly, crouching in the shade with reed flasks of lukewarm beer, yes, brewed by the servants you met earlier. They gulp, wipe their mouths, then return. Sand never stops blowing, so neither can they. A mainstream fact grounds you again. In workers' villages like Deir el Medina, Ostraca, pottery shards, record rations of beer and bread given specifically to crews tasked with floor clearing. That means this wasn't an imagined duty. It was logged, paid, organized. Someone out there made sure even janitorial labor was bureaucratically tracked. Ancient HR existed, and somewhere a scribe probably sighed about sand quotas. Late in the day, a small procession arrives, priests carrying offerings. They don't look down. They don't see the servants retreating to the shadows. But their bare feet touch sand so smooth it feels like silk, and their god receives the offering without interruption. That was the goal. If nothing disrupted the ritual, the sand sifters succeeded. Success meant invisibility. Failure meant punishment. You linger as night falls again. The sifters sweep by torchlight, faint glows bouncing across the ground. It's strangely poetic. Fire from the torchbearers you just left guiding dust sifters who'll never meet them, yet whose jobs overlap. Without clean floors, no torch procession looks regal. Without torchlight, no sweeping can continue after dusk. You see the invisible chain linking every servant together. One last image stays with you. A servant shaking a sieve until his arms nearly give out, grains whispering down like golden rain, forming a surface smooth enough to walk upon. It's an act you dismiss as small, until you realize it's repeated daily, for centuries, across temples from Thebes to Memphis. Their labor, forgotten and nameless, literally paved the way for gods. You leave the temple courtyards, dust still clinging to your feet, and follow a thin passage that opens into a chamber heavy with fragrance. The air here is thick, almost syrupy, filled with the scent of myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and oils you can't even name. This is the workshop of the perfume grinders, servants bent over slabs of alabaster, pounding petals, roots, and resins into pastes that would one day glide across a queen's skin or smoke upward toward the nostrils of the gods. It feels like stepping into a chemist's shop fused with a flower garden and, let's be honest, a little like Sephora before Sephora had air conditioning. The servants squat in lines, each with a shallow mortar of alabaster, stone pestles polished smooth from decades of grinding. The sound is constant: scrape, pound, scrape again. Their arms ripple with repetitive strength. You watch one woman crush blue lotus petals, the paste staining her fingertips. Another servant grinds frankincense resin, each stroke releasing waves of honeyed, citrusy smoke as if the stone itself were sweating perfume. Perfume wasn't luxury alone. It was survival in a land where sweat and heat turned every noble gathering into a competition of who smelled least like a donkey stable. Egyptians wore cones of scented wax on their heads at banquets, slowly melting through the evening. The perfume grinders made those cones possible. Without them, court life would reek, literally. Historians still argue whether these grinders were permanent temple staff, palace specialists, or enslaved laborers pressed into aromatic service. Some evidence points to temple compounds where perfume production was sacred, offerings of myrrh and incense presented daily. Other sources suggest noblewomen employed their own perfume servants, crafting signature scents. Either way, the grinders were invisible yet indispensable. A mainstream fact: jars of perfume and ointments, sealed in alabaster, are among the most common finds in tombs. King Tutankhamun's tomb alone contained dozens of such containers, some still holding faint traces of fragrance after millennia. Imagine a smell surviving thousands of years. That's how powerful and carefully made these concoctions were. You lean closer, inhaling. The mix is dizzying, sweet but sharp, floral but resinous. Your eyes water slightly from the intensity. One servant coughs, pressing a cloth over her nose. No one ever mentions the downsides. Endless grinding meant resin dust lodged in lungs, headaches from overpowering scents, and stained skin that never truly came clean. A quirky tidbit: certain perfumes were believed to protect against demons or attract love. Some recipes even included crocodile fat mixed with herbs. Yes, the same crocodiles that temple keepers later fed raw meat. Ancient Egypt really loved recycling animal parts in creative, if slightly gross, ways. Imagine explaining your signature scent. Oh, it's crocodile chic with notes of lotus. The grinders work in rhythm, occasionally humming songs to keep time. You imagine an ancient perfume playlist, something like, "Now that's what I call Lotus, Volume 2. A young apprentice, clearly new, crushes petals too coarsely, earning a sharp scolding from the overseer. Precision mattered. Too much pounding destroyed oils, too little left the mixture weak. This wasn't mindless labor. It was chemistry wrapped in ritual. The irony? Most grinders would never wear the perfumes they created. These scents were for nobles, priests, and gods. The servants themselves lived with the raw ingredients, but rarely the finished luxury. It's like working in a chocolate factory and never tasting a truffle. Still, the workshop buzzes with meaning. Priests drop by to request special blends for ceremonies, resin to burn for Osiris, lotus oil for funerary rites. The grinders obey, sometimes adding whispers of their own prayers as they stir. They may not step into the holy sanctuaries, but their work slips inside on every wisp of smoke and every slick drop on a priest's forehead. A debate persists among scholars. Were these perfumes mainly practical, masking odor, or were they primarily symbolic, embodying purity and divinity? Maybe both. The Egyptians loved dual purposes. Perfume made nobles tolerable to sit beside, But it also turned the human into something godlike, surrounded by invisible clouds of sanctity. You notice a grinder using a stone roller, spreading oil across papyrus to test consistency. The faint sheen looks almost magical in lamplight. Another servant carefully funnels liquid into a narrow-necked jar, sealing it with clay and pressing a symbol into the stopper. Each jar becomes a little time capsule, waiting to travel centuries. You realize some of these very jars will outlast pyramids, quietly keeping fragrance trapped until archaeologists crack them open millennia later. Your nose adjusts, though the scents are still dizzying. You find yourself smiling at one grinder's quiet joke. He holds up a clump of sticky resin and mutters that it looks exactly like donkey droppings. His neighbor stifles a laugh, pounding harder to cover the sound. Even here, amid divine work, humor seeps in. Humans can't grind resin for 12 hours without cracking a joke about it. A mainstream fact sneaks back in. Texts from the Ebers Papyrus and other medical scrolls describe perfumes not only as luxuries but as medicines, ointments for wounds, balms for headaches, and salves against infections. In some cases, perfume wasn't just about smelling divine, it was about staying alive. The room grows warmer as fires heat oils for infusion. Servants pour melted fat, goose, ox, even crocodile, into jars with ground herbs. The fat solidifies as it cools, trapping fragrance. It's messy, greasy work, hands coated in slick layers. You cringe as one servant wipes her arm across her forehead, leaving a shiny streak like she's auditioning for ancient Egypt's greasiest glow-up. Outside, nobles pass by, breathing the sweet air, barely noticing the workers creating it. Yet inside, every stroke of pestle against mortar echoes like a heartbeat. These servants, nameless in history, turned flowers, bark, and sap into invisible power. Their scents wrapped pharaohs, kissed gods, and lingered in tombs long after empires fell. As night draws near again, the grinders wash their mortars, stacking them neatly. The floor is slick with spilled oil, fragrant enough to choke flies. The servants gather scraps, petals, dust, clumps of resin too impure for jars, and toss them onto a small fire. The smoke rises, perfuming the courtyard. For a moment, everyone pauses, breathing in their own creation. It's a fleeting reward, a brief chance to share what they've made for others. You step back into the cooler night air, scents clinging to your skin. You realize this is the opposite of the sand sifters you left earlier. Those servants erased chaos grain by grain. These grinders bottled order in liquid form, trapping beauty in jars. Both invisible, both forgotten, yet both shaping the very fabric of Egyptian life. You drift from the resin-thick perfume workshop into a hall where air moves differently. It isn't the smoky heaviness of torches, nor the yeast-sour thickness of beer. Here it's a soft, artificial breeze coaxed by servants whose arms never rest. You find yourself among the lotus fan wavers, attendants stationed beside nobles and royals, their duty both absurdly simple and endlessly exhausting: wave, wave, wave. The scene is almost comical at first. A noble reclines on a low couch, sipping from a beer jar, while two servants stand at either side, each gripping long poles tipped with broad lotus fans. They move in rhythm, creating currents of air that keep the noble cool. You can't help but think, Egypt invented the human ceiling fan centuries before electricity. And you? You'd last about 3 minutes before your arms gave out, and the noble would complain that your fan etiquette was sloppy. The fans themselves are beautiful. Reed stalks bound with palm fronds or lotus blossoms, sometimes even ostrich feathers dyed with pigments. They shimmer in the dim light, each sweep scattering a faint floral scent into the room. The noble sighs contentedly, never glancing at the servants keeping him from roasting. That's the role: be invisible, be constant, and definitely don't sneeze into the breeze. Historians still argue whether these fan wavers were slaves, household servants, or sometimes even honored attendants in ceremonies. Some depictions show fan bearers in formal processions beside the pharaoh, their task elevated almost to ritual. Others suggest they were the lowest of the low, forgotten after the noble's nap. The truth probably shifted depending on the setting. A mainstream fact: ceremonial fans were often made of ostrich feathers mounted on gilded handles. Archaeologists have discovered fan handles in tombs, sometimes inlaid with gold and ivory. These weren't just tools, they were status symbols. If your tomb had a fan buried with you, it meant you lived a life cool enough to warrant eternal breezes. But daily fan waving, the kind you see now, wasn't glamorous. It was grueling. One servant's shoulders shake from fatigue, yet he forces his arms higher. Another rubs his wrist quickly when the noble looks away. You almost want to step in and give them a break, but then you imagine trying to fan nonstop for hours. Joke's on you, you'd collapse, and the noble would just demand another servant, maybe two, to keep things breezy. A quirky tidbit: lotus flowers, often fixed at the end of the fans, weren't just decorative. Egyptians believed the lotus had purifying properties and symbolized rebirth. So when a servant waved lotus-scented air toward a noble, it wasn't just comfort, it was a symbolic blessing. You're basically getting air conditioning and spiritual renewal in one draft. You picture banquets under these fans. Rows of servants line the hall, waving in unison, while nobles feast on goose and figs. The sound is subtle, a soft whooshing like waves against the shore. It sets a rhythm, hypnotic and soothing, maybe even lulling drunken nobles into deeper satisfaction. You imagine being at one of those feasts. Forget the food, you'd be distracted by the endless chorus of arms pumping like synchronized swimmers who drew the short straw. One servant nearby whispers to another, joking that his fan has killed more flies than his hand ever has. The two stifle laughter. It's these tiny rebellions that keep them going, humor tucked between monotonous strokes. Their wrists ache, but at least they can laugh about doubling as bug control devices. A mainstream fact adds weight. Fan bearers were depicted in religious iconography standing beside gods or pharaohs. Their roles symbolized divine authority. Only the greatest rulers were worthy of constant breezes. Imagine being a god and still needing a human air conditioner. Divinity, apparently, didn't come with climate control. The work also had a darker side. Fan wavers stood close to nobles for hours, breathing their sweat and listening to their conversations, yet never allowed to speak unless commanded. They were part furniture, part stagehand. If their rhythm faltered, they risked being struck or dismissed. You sense the tension in the way one servant's eyes dart constantly toward his master's face, gauging whether his strokes are pleasing enough. Still, there's dignity in their persistence. The fans themselves, crafted with artistry, were extensions of cosmic order. By cooling the noble, the servant upheld the balance of comfort, hierarchy, and ritual. Historians still argue whether the fans' symbolism outweighed their practicality, but here you see both woven together, air to breathe, and status to display. The scene shifts outdoors. During processions, servants carry enormous feather fans beside the pharaoh's litter. The feathers catch the sun, flashing like signals to the crowd. You imagine the awe, commoners bowing as the breeze stirred by human hands flows around a ruler who never sweats in public. That's power, when even the air itself seems loyal. Back in the chamber, the noble stirs, murmurs something, and the servants adjust their angle. They're like living thermostats, fine-tuning the draft without complaint. You wonder if they dream of wind, real, free wind rushing across the Nile, not this artificial imitation. Perhaps their only reward comes at night, when their arms finally fall still and they step outside into the natural night breeze, grateful for air that doesn't demand labor. One last detail lingers. Tucked in the corner, a small pile of discarded fans, frayed and broken. They look pitiful, their lotus heads wilted, fronds split from overuse. Servants will repair some, weave new ones, and the cycle continues. Fans live and die quickly here, like the people who wield them, forgotten the moment they stop moving air. As you step away, you catch the rhythm of the whooshing fans fading behind you. It's almost like the beat of a lullaby, a soft pulse of human endurance. You think back to torchbearers and beer brewers, to sand sifters and perfume grinders. Each role is absurd in its own way, yet without them, the grand machinery of Egypt would stall. Tonight you leave cooled, not by fan wavers themselves, but by the knowledge that forgotten hands once labored to stir air where no breeze blew. The fans fade, and with them the sound of sighing nobles. You follow the breeze outward, stepping through reed-matted doors into a humbler corner of the Nile's edge. Here, work hums differently, not the rhythm of arms waving, but the soft, persistent hiss of reeds being stripped, twisted, and woven. You have arrived among the mat weavers. The smell greets you first, green reeds, wet and sweet, stacked in heaps that reach higher than a man's shoulders. Families crouch barefoot in the mud, tugging stalks from bundles, trimming them with small knives, and knotting them together with a speed born of repetition. The mats they create will serve everywhere: palace chambers, temple floors, tomb linings, even the backs of donkeys. It is the kind of trade that touches every level of society, yet its makers remain invisible. Mainstream historians agree, reeds, especially papyrus and halfagrass, were among Egypt's most versatile resources. Beyond mats, they became baskets, ropes, sandals, even boats. Archaeologists have unearthed mats so well preserved in dry tombs that their patterns still look fresh, though their makers' names vanished millennia ago. That's the irony: you can touch the mat, but never know the hands that wove it. The weavers' bodies move in practiced unison. A boy holds the reed taut while his mother braids, her fingers flicking with a rhythm like a harpist. An old man presses the mat flat with his heel, aligning its edges so that it lies straight. Everyone has a role, even toddlers, who hand reeds from the pile. If fan waving demanded endurance, mat weaving demanded endless patience. Each mistake means an uneven floor covering, and nobles would not tolerate wrinkles beneath their banquet cushions. You crouch closer, watching a woman pattern dark and light reeds together into simple geometry. It is art hidden in utility. No one in the palace will notice, yet she weaves beauty anyway. Perhaps it is her quiet rebellion, sneaking symmetry into the footsteps of the wealthy. You almost want to compliment her, but here, your voice would be as out of place as a noble's sandal in the mud. A quirky tidbit: some Egyptian mats doubled as makeshift bedding, rolled up during the day and unfurled at night. In poorer households, mats were everything: floor, bed, and sometimes even shroud. To die wrapped in your own woven mat was not uncommon, and archaeologists still uncover such burials. For the weaver, then, each mat carried the weight of both life and death. The soundscape is hypnotic: reeds splitting, fibers snapping, water sloshing as fresh bundles are dunked to stay pliable. Over it all comes low chatter. One weaver jokes about reeds that bite harder than crocodiles, showing off a bleeding finger. Another tells of a noble who slipped on a loose mat and blamed the servants, as though woven reeds had plotted mutiny. The laughter is brief, swallowed quickly by the rhythm of work. Mainstream fact-checkers emphasize that reed matting was a backbone of Egyptian daily life. Without mats, feasts would be eaten in the dust, temples would echo with the scrape of bare stone, and tombs would lack the softness required for eternity. Yet this industry rarely appears in monuments or official inscriptions. Kings celebrated victories and gods, not the humble reed. The silence of history is loud here. You imagine the mat's journey. Carried on donkey backs into the city, laid out in storerooms, selected by stewards who never asked names, then unrolled beneath nobles who spilled wine without care. Days or months later, tossed aside, burned, or reused until tatters. The lifespan of a mat was short, but its necessity eternal. Every palace gathering you've glimpsed in earlier halls rests, literally, on these weavers' backs. One mat lies finished at your feet. Its edges are frayed, its weave slightly crooked, perhaps a practice piece or one destined for a poorer household. You touch it, and it is rough yet strangely warm, holding the memory of hands. You wonder if anyone ever wove a mat for themselves, or if all of it was always for others: nobles, temples, the dead. There's a moment you'll remember: a child weaving her very first reed into a mat. She grins, proud, and her mother pats her head, already teaching the next generation to repeat the endless cycle. The mat won't survive long, but the act will. In that sense, mat weaving wasn't just craft, it was inheritance. Historians often call Egypt a civilization of stone: pyramids, temples, monuments. But standing here, you see the truth: it was just as much a civilization of reeds, woven daily by hands that history never named. Without reeds, no comfort. Without mats, no ceremonies. Without these weavers, nobles would have sat on bare dust, their grandeur crumbling into discomfort. The Nile breeze lifts a finished mat, flapping its edge against your ankle. For a moment it feels alive, whispering that every empire rests on what gets overlooked. You step back, leaving the family to their weaving, and carry that whisper with you as you turn toward the next hidden corner. You wander away from the reed mats, your sandals brushing sand that seems determined to seep into every seam of your skin. The Nile's breath follows you, faint and damp, until it gives way to the sharp tang of salt and dust. Your ears adjust to a new rhythm, scraping, chiseling, the occasional clang of a tool hitting stone. You've reached the salt gatherers and stone polishers, those quiet laborers whose fingerprints linger in places grander than their own lives ever were. The air is harsh here. Salt sparkles on the ground in brittle crystals, crunching beneath your steps like broken glass. Men and women crouch with baskets, scooping fistfuls of the mineral that will preserve meat, season food, and embalm kings. The sun reflects cruelly off the white surfaces, blinding enough that you squint. No sunglasses, no shade, just eyelids fighting against a glare that could melt your brain like butter on hot bread. You probably wouldn't survive a morning out here. Your modern sunscreen wouldn't stand a chance. Salt, for the Egyptians, wasn't just about flavor. Mainstream historians point out its sacred role in preservation. Without salt, mummies would have rotted long before they were ready to be wrapped in their fancy linens. Salt was eternity's quiet ingredient, the unsung hero in the recipe for the afterlife. While pharaohs boasted about pyramids, these gatherers were scraping away the real magic, one back-breaking basket at a time. Nearby, stone polishers bend over slabs of limestone and granite. Their arms flex as they rub smooth blocks destined for temples, statues, or even sarcophagi. The tools are primitive: sandstone rubbers, quartz grit, and water poured to soften the grind, but the results gleam with a finish that looks machine-made. It's humbling, almost unsettling, to realize that what takes a modern worker with power tools can be achieved by ancient laborers armed with only muscle and monotony. You lean closer, and the sound of polishing grows intimate, a rough whisper, back and forth, like waves gnawing at a shore. The stone, once dull, begins to shine. You could almost use it as a mirror, though you'd prefer not to, considering your face right now probably looks like sweaty, half-baked bread dough. Quirky tidbit for you: salt was also used as ancient toothpaste. Egyptians crushed it with herbs and ashes to scrub their teeth. Sure, it kept things clean, but it also eroded enamel. So if you imagine chatting with a salt gatherer, be ready for a smile full of gaps. Kind of like ancient chiclets, but angrier. The labor takes its toll. You see shoulders red and raw from carrying baskets, eyes squinting through the glare, fingers cracked from stone dust. The polishers cough as clouds rise from their grinding. One worker mutters about the stone having a personality of its own, refusing to smooth evenly no matter how hard he rubs. Another complains that salt crystals sneak into his bedding at night, scratching him even in his dreams. Historians still argue whether these workers were state-employed specialists or temporary conscripts dragged from villages during building projects. Either way, their names are lost, erased by the same stones they polished. Pharaohs carved their own names into monuments, but never those of the hands that made them shine. You crouch beside a slab halfway polished. Run your palm across it, one side rough, the other slippery smooth. It's like touching two different worlds. You imagine the stone's journey from this dusty field to a grand temple wall, where priests will splash incense smoke and nobles will bow, all while never realizing the surface they kneel on once blistered someone's fingers. The scene plays tricks with your mind. Salt, stone, glare, grit, everything feels eternal and temporary at once. The salt will dissolve in water, yet it preserves bodies for thousands of years. The polished stone will stand for centuries, yet the men who shaped it will crumble into dust before their first gray hair. That's the paradox: fleeting lives carving permanence. One young boy, no older than 10, drags a basket of salt half his size. He grins as though it's a game, not realizing he's inheriting the same toil as his father. You think about your childhood, video games, snacks, naps, and compare it to his. Let's be honest, you wouldn't last 5 minutes in his sandals. The workers chant softly as they polish, a rhythm to keep their muscles from giving up. The words are lost in time, but the tone is clear, part prayer, part complaint, part lullaby. You catch yourself swaying, lulled by the back and forth rasp, until you almost forget the sun overhead. Without them, no temple would gleam, no mummy would last, no feast would stay fresh. Yet you won't find their names in the king lists or painted on tomb walls. They remain in the salt grains you taste on your lips, in the shine of the stone under your palm. Invisible, yet essential. The breeze picks up, carrying salt dust into your throat. You cough, wave it away, and step back. The workers keep polishing, keep scooping, their rhythm endless. You retreat slowly, knowing the next hidden trade waits, while behind you, salt continues to crackle under the relentless Egyptian sun. You follow the sound of soft fabric flapping in the wind, leaving behind the glitter of salt and the groan of grinding stones. The Nile's breeze sharpens here, tugging at scraps of cloth pinned to lines and catching the smoke from a low fire. You've arrived where the linen weavers and perfume mixers huddle, two trades that shaped Egypt's look and smell long before anyone thought about deodorant or fast fashion. The air is thick with contrasts. On one side, women sit cross-legged with looms, their fingers darting like sparrows across taut threads. On the other side, jars bubble gently as herbs, resins, and oils simmer together, each sending up trails of perfume sweet enough to mask the sweat of 10 oxen. Your nose doesn't know whether to sneeze or swoon. Linen, you quickly realize, was the superstar fabric of Egypt. Made from flax stalks that had been soaked, beaten, and combed until pliable, it clothed everyone from peasants in plain tunics to pharaohs wrapped in threads so fine it was nearly transparent. Mainstream historians confirm that mummies themselves were swaddled in endless strips of linen, sometimes hundreds of meters long. So yes, when you tuck in your bedsheets tonight, think of ancient weavers who spent their whole lives making endless bedsheets for eternity. One weaver hums a tune as she passes the shuttle back and forth. Her loom creaks with each beat, a steady percussion that almost hypnotizes you. She doesn't look up, but she mutters. Each thread is a prayer. Whether that's poetry or exhaustion, you can't tell, but you feel the truth in it. Linen was sacred. Temples demanded offerings of fresh bolts. Priests needed endless supplies. Ordinary folk wore linen daily, though theirs was rougher, scratchier, more potato sack than designer tunic. Here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient Egyptian linen was so prized that some bolts were even used as money. Imagine walking into a shop, slapping down a roll of fabric, and saying, "I'll take that goat, please." Today, you need a credit card. Back then, a finely woven cloth might do the trick. Not far away, you lean toward the perfume makers. Clay pots rest over low coals, their contents stirred with reeds. The scent hits you, spicy cinnamon, sharp myrrh, sweet lotus. One worker carefully presses flowers, squeezing oil into a jar. Another grinds frankincense resin, adding it to melted fat that will hold the fragrance longer. The mixture bubbles, releasing a smell so rich you half expect Cleopatra herself to stroll in for a sample. Historians still argue whether these perfume makers worked mainly for temples or for private households. Temples demanded incense for rituals, while wealthy women wanted oils for their wigs, skin, and, let's be honest, for luring lovers. Whatever the case, these mixers had recipes guarded more tightly than your grandma's secret stew. Some formulas have been rediscovered through residue in jars, but others remain mysteries locked away in the sands. You watch as one man tests his concoction by rubbing a dab behind his ear. He closes his eyes, inhales, then nods in satisfaction. He notices you staring and chuckles, saying, "Even the gods follow their noses." Honestly, he's not wrong. Religious texts describe divine beings as pleased with sweet fragrance. If your offerings smell bad, maybe the gods turned up their celestial noses. The weaving continues nearby. A child runs between the looms, nearly tangling himself in the threads. His mother scolds him, threatening to turn him into the next bolt of linen if he doesn't sit down. You grin. It's the same kind of weary humor every parent in history has used. Some things never change. A little joke plays in your mind. Imagine an ancient job interview. "So, what skills do you bring?" "Well, I can weave 200 meters of fine linen without going cross-eyed." Hired. Benefits include sunburn and backache. The perfume side isn't much easier. The mixers deal with sticky resins, hot coals, and endless sneezing from clouds of ground spices. Their hands are perpetually stained with oils, their clothes perfumed so deeply that even after washing, the smell lingers. One complains, "My wife says she can track me from the market to the house." Honestly, free GPS. You crouch beside a basket of raw flax fibers, running them through your fingers. They're rough, scratchy, nothing like the finished linen you've seen in museums. It's humbling to realize the transformation required: soak, beat, comb, spin, weave. Each step demanded patience bordering on saintly. You doubt you'd last 5 minutes before tossing the whole pile in frustration and inventing polyester instead. As the weavers pass the shuttle back and forth, you notice the rhythm resembles breathing: inhale, exhale, over, under. The cloth grows steadily, inch by inch, a patient defiance of time. Meanwhile, the perfume makers swirl their concoctions, the scents mingling in the air until you feel dizzy. Linen for the body, perfume for the senses. Together, these workers dressed Egypt not just in fabric, but in aura. The sun begins to sink, turning the Nile bronze. A woman lifts a fresh bolt of linen from her loom, stretching it proudly. It's fine, nearly sheer, glowing in the late light. Another corks a jar of oil, sealing fragrance for someone's bath or burial. Both crafts whisper permanence, though their makers remain nameless. No tomb walls celebrate the weaver's cramped fingers or the mixer's burned hands. And yet, without them, pharaohs would have gone naked and gods unscented. You inhale one last lungful of the mingled smells: linen dust, lotus oil, resin smoke. It clings to you like memory. Then you step back, careful not to tangle yourself in a loom string, leaving the workers to their eternal weaving and stirring. You follow the shuffle of sandals scraping dust, the muttered counting of numbers under breath, and the scratch of reed pens on papyrus. The smell of resin and ink creeps into your nose before you even see the source. You've wandered into the world of grain counters and scribes, those silent figures who kept Egypt's great machine humming, one tally at a time. The place feels less like a workshop and more like a buzzing office, if your office happened to have walls of mud brick and no air conditioning. Reed baskets overflow with barley, wheat, and emmer. Men with shaved heads bend over low tables, scratching hieratic script onto papyrus rolls. You hear numbers recited like incantations. 10 sacks, 3 jars, half a measure. You're half tempted to ask for a calculator app, but good luck explaining Wi-Fi to someone who thinks the Nile floods because gods feel moody. The mainstream fact is clear: scribes were the backbone of bureaucracy. Without them, the pharaoh's taxes, temple offerings, and granary stocks would dissolve into chaos. They learned their trade young, often sons of scribes before them, bent over school tablets while teachers whacked them for sloppy signs. By adulthood, their skill with symbols made them indispensable. One famous Egyptian saying even bragged, "The scribe's pen is mightier than the soldier's sword." Of course, try telling that to the soldier with a spear aimed at your ribs. You watch a counter weigh a sack of grain on a balanced scale, moving smooth stones until both sides dip evenly. He marks the tally with a quick stroke, then passes the sack along. The scribe beside him logs the entry, lips pursed, muttering, "If it isn't written, it doesn't exist." Honestly, that's the ancient version of "Pix or it didn't happen." Here's your quirky tidbit: ancient scribes didn't use erasers. Mistakes meant either crossing things out messily or scraping the ink away with a sharp tool. Imagine the pressure of getting taxes right when your only undo button was a knife. You'd probably write neater too. Around you, the air grows tense. A farmer stands nervously before a counter, protesting that his sacks came up light only because mice nibbled them. The scribe raises an eyebrow, unimpressed. He dips his pen, makes a note, and mutters, "Mice don't eat this much." The farmer sighs. You realize bureaucracy has always been merciless, whether in papyrus scrolls or modern spreadsheets. Historians still argue whether scribes held true power or were simply cogs. On one hand, they recorded the will of pharaohs and priests. On the other, they could fudge numbers, tilt scales, or lose documents conveniently. Some records even hint at corruption trials. So were scribes humble servants or sly puppet masters? The debate remains open, and honestly, both sound plausible. You glance around the room. It's strangely comforting, all this order. Rows of clay ceilings mark storerooms, each impression unique, pressed by rings or carved stones. Each mark says, "This sack belongs to the temple, not to you, greedy hands." It feels like an ancient barcode system. You half expect one of the scribes to scan the sacks with a beep. The jokes write themselves. Imagine a grain counter complaining, "My job is just weighing bags all day." A scribe answers, "At least your job doesn't give you writer's cramp and ink-stained fingers forever." And somewhere, a modern office worker sighs, "Same, buddy. Same." You lean closer to watch a young apprentice practice on a scrap of astrakhan, broken pottery used like notepads. His letters wobble, uneven and shaky. His master raps him lightly on the head, muttering, "Even the gods need legible handwriting." You smile, reminded of your own messy notes back in school. Some things really never change. The clatter of scales blends with the rustle of papyrus. You notice the rhythmic motions, measure, weigh, mark, record. It's almost like a ritual dance, precise and endlessly repeated. Each entry safeguards Egypt's lifeline, food. Without these tallies, granaries might empty, armies might starve, temples might collapse. The whole civilization, glittering in gold and stone, secretly depends on the guys counting bags of grain in hot storerooms. A thought lingers: what happens when the Nile fails to flood? Drought years must have turned these places into battlegrounds of blame. Counters marking down. Short harvest. Scribes logging desperate pleas, farmers insisting the gods were angry at someone else. It must have been chaos in neat handwriting. You feel a tap on your shoulder. A scribe with tired eyes grins at you and says, "Write this down, paper never forgets." He chuckles, returns to his role, and you realize he just dropped the ancient world's sassiest mic. By now, the sun outside has dipped, and the scribes light oil lamps. The glow throws golden halos around reed pens and ink palettes. Their shadows stretch across papyrus like long fingers, still writing, still counting. Grain, gods, taxes, offerings, it all passes through their pens. You watch a little longer, then step quietly away, leaving them scribbling Egypt into existence one line at a time. The air changes the moment you step away from the ink-stained hands of the scribes. Gone is the rustle of papyrus and the clink of scales. Now you're bathed in the hammer-thud rhythm of stone striking stone. You've walked into the lives of stonemasons and quarry servants, men and women who spent entire days carving eternity out of limestone and granite. Dust swirls everywhere. It clings to your skin, your lashes, even settles in your mouth with that chalky grit you can almost taste. The workers don't cough, they're used to it. Their muscles glisten with sweat under the Egyptian sun, shoulders and backs rippling as they swing dollarite pounders into stone faces. Each crack echoes like thunder, and the ground trembles under your sandals. You think about modern gyms, people lifting weights for fun, while here, these people are building the world's wonders one exhausting blow at a time. Here's your mainstream fact. The pyramids, temples, and obelisks you've seen in glossy history books were carved largely by these anonymous laborers. Not slaves in chains, as Hollywood sometimes insists, but conscripted peasants during flood seasons or skilled stonemasons employed year-round. Their work required training, precision, and an almost terrifying endurance. The Great Pyramid alone demanded millions of limestone blocks, each shaped and hauled with nothing but stone tools, rope, and human stubbornness. You catch sight of a line of men levering a block up a wooden ramp, chanting in unison. Their rhythm keeps the block from slipping back. You're tempted to hum along, but your modern sneakers would betray you before the first verse. If you thought IKEA furniture was hard to assemble, try building a 40-ton obelisk without an instruction manual. Now for a quirky tidbit. Ancient quarrymen sometimes left doodles carved into the rocks where they worked. Little stick-figure men, animals, or hieroglyph jokes, graffiti thousands of years old. Imagine finishing 12 hours of chiseling granite and then carving a goofy drawing of your buddy with a donkey's ears. Proof that even when building monuments to gods, workers still needed to blow off steam. The debate among historians? Whether the laborers were proud craftsmen or reluctant conscripts. Some argue they were honored, rewarded with beer, bread, and exemptions from other taxes. Others insist the work was brutal duty, a back-breaking draft no one could refuse. The truth might lie somewhere between, pride and misery chiseling side by side. You walk deeper into the quarry. The sound intensifies, hammer on stone, ropes creaking, commands shouted in the sun. You watch a group measuring a block with cords, marking precise cuts with red ochre lines. They talk of angles and balance, their eyes squinting in focus. One coughs, mutters about dust in his throat, and another jokes. You'll breathe stone long before you breathe air again. You chuckle softly. Dark humor survives every century. A foreman leads you toward an unfinished obelisk, half-carved and still lying stubbornly in bedrock. It stretches longer than a bus, cracks running through its length. Abandoned, it sits as a frozen mistake, a reminder that even the best plans crumble under nature's weight. You imagine the heartbreak of realizing weeks, maybe months, of labor would never rise to the sky. It's the ancient equivalent of your laptop crashing right before you save the document. Except instead of retyping 20 pages, they lost 20 tons of granite. You can almost feel the ache in your own shoulders as you watch a team swing tools, sparks flicking in the sun. A child, no more than 10, scurries nearby carrying water jars. Even the youngest were part of this grinding machine. You wonder if he'll grow up with hands already hardened like stone. The masons murmur about gods, their chisels echoing prayers. Each blow isn't just work, it's devotion. To carve a temple was to carve eternity. One worker, pausing for breath, tells you proudly, "The gods see every stroke. My name will vanish, but the stone will remain." You feel the weight of his words like the stone around you. Still, their lives weren't only reverent. Someone nearby cracks a joke about how granite is harder than his mother-in-law's forehead. The men laugh, wiping sweat, shoulders shaking. You grin too. It's a joke that would still land in any modern lunch break. The sun drops slowly, shadows stretching across the quarry walls. Torches flare, smoke curling upward. The men keep swinging, their faces lit in flickers of gold and shadow. The sound becomes a lullaby of stone and fire, a rhythm as old as time. You feel yourself drifting with it, lulled by repetition, by sweat, by history etched one blow at a time. And as you leave, dust still clinging to your clothes, you glance back at the unfinished obelisk. It waits, cracked but defiant, whispering that not all labor is rewarded, not all dreams completed. Yet even failures leave their mark, carved stubbornly into the earth. The clang of chisels fades, but the smell of wet clay and ashes creeps into your nose. You've wandered from the quarries into the world of potters and clay handlers, servants whose entire lives revolved around mud and fire. The ground under your sandals feels softer here, damp from pits dug deep to reach mild clay. It squishes slightly, and you immediately regret not wearing boots. Imagine stepping on an old pizza slice barefoot. That's about the texture you're dealing with. You see them everywhere, hunched figures kneading lumps of clay, bare arms slick with wet grit, fingers strong and fast. They shape vessels in one steady motion, hands gliding like practiced dancers. Bowls, jars, lamps, everything you've seen behind glass in museums once spun between these palms. The wheel creaks with every turn, a sound so hypnotic it could put you to sleep if the furnace nearby didn't roar like a dragon clearing its throat. Here's your mainstream fact. Pottery was absolutely essential in Egypt. Forget plastic Tupperware. Clay jars stored grain, water, beer, wine, oils, even makeup powders. And those amphora-like jars? They were practically the UPS boxes of the Nile, carrying goods to markets or onto ships. Without potters, you'd have no way to eat, drink, store, or trade. Civilization would grind to a messy halt. You bend down, brush your fingers along a newly dried pot. The surface is smooth, cool. The potter smirks at your curiosity. He's missing 2 teeth but has hands steadier than a surgeon's. He slaps the clay, pats it once, and tells you with a grin, "This one will hold beer." "Without me, soldiers would cry." You believe him? Soldiers probably did. Now for the quirky tidbit. Egyptians sometimes recycled broken pottery shards, known as ostraca, as scrap paper. Need to jot down a shopping list? Scribble it on a shard. Got a student practicing hieroglyphs? Hand him some pottery trash. Some ostraca even carry little doodles, like donkeys playing harps or cats serving drinks. Ancient memes, if you will, proving that sarcasm was already alive and well along the Nile. Historians still argue whether pottery making was considered an honored craft or a menial job. On one hand, skilled artisans produced beautiful, painted pieces that lasted millennia. On the other, everyday potters were dusty, sweaty laborers whose names you'll never know. Were they celebrated craftsmen or invisible servants of utility? The debate remains as muddy as the clay itself. You wander closer to the kiln. The heat blasts your face instantly, like opening an oven preheated for eternity. The flames lick at the stacked vessels, orange light flickering through vents. The workers move quickly, feeding wood, adjusting airflow, eyes narrowed against smoke. Their timing must be perfect. Too hot, and the pots crack. Too cool, and they harden weak. One servant mutters, "The fire has moods." You must beg it to cooperate. You half expect him to start singing lullabies to the kiln. Honestly, maybe it would help. A young apprentice nearby stomps clay with his feet, grinding straw into the mix. It looks like he's dancing, except his expression is pure misery. He sighs, mutters something about never escaping mud duty. You chuckle. Every workplace has its interns. Your sandals crunch on shards scattered across the floor. Pots that didn't survive the fire lay shattered, discarded. Failures are inevitable, but waste has its uses. Those shards become writing tablets, insulation, or simply sharp edges for cutting. Nothing goes unused. Egyptians were the original zero-waste influencers, long before it was trendy. One potter shapes a lamp, thumb pressing the reservoir where oil will pool. He glances up and says, "Without these, night is blind." You pause, suddenly realizing how true that is. Imagine an ancient home without even a flicker of lamplight, darkness swallowing everything after sunset. His hands keep moving, unbothered, sculpting light itself from mud. The work is repetitive, but the workers joke, tease, and even sing. A chorus drifts from a group shaping jars. "Beer, beer, beer, may the jar not crack." You smile. Karaoke night, Egyptian edition. One man even balances a jar on his head mid-song, wobbling dramatically until his friends laugh and yell at him to quit before he ruins good clay. By late afternoon, rows of pots stretch across the yard, glistening in the sun like a fleet of brown soldiers awaiting inspection. You picture them marching off, carrying grain, wine, and oil across the kingdom. Servants may have made them, but their reach was everywhere, from palaces to villages, temples to tombs. A breeze shifts, carrying smoke, laughter, and the eternal smell of clay. You find yourself oddly comforted by the rhythm, the squish of wet hands, the creak of the wheel, the whoosh of the fire. The cycle is endless, repetitive, and strangely soothing. And as you turn away, a child runs by clutching a still wet pot, grinning proudly. Maybe his work will survive 3,000 years, end up in a museum under sterile glass. Or maybe it'll shatter tomorrow, turned into shopping lists and donkey memes. Either way, the hands that shaped it will be forgotten, yet the mud keeps whispering their story. You drift away from the smoke of kilns and the crunch of pottery shards, and the air takes on a different flavor: herbs, oils, a faint tang of copper. You've stepped into the quieter world of healers and temple servants who specialized in health and medicine. Not doctors in the white coat sense, but attendants who kept bodies functioning and spirits soothed. You might say they were the ancient version of pharmacy clerks mixed with spa workers, though with a touch of holy ritual thrown in. A woman sits cross-legged grinding something dark and sticky in a stone mortar. She looks up briefly, then goes back to her work, pounding rhythmically with a pestle. The smell is strong: honey, garlic, and what might just be mold. You wrinkle your nose, but she doesn't care. To her, this isn't a culinary experiment gone wrong, it's medicine. Egyptians were famous for using honey as an antibacterial agent. In fact, here's your mainstream fact. Honey dressings for wounds were one of the most effective remedies of the ancient world. Band-aid with a sweet aftertaste, essentially. A servant nearby prepares strips of linen, carefully tearing and rolling them. These aren't for mummies, not yet, they're bandages. Someone else heats oil infused with cedar and mint, ready to be rubbed on aching joints. You catch a whiff, and honestly, it smells like an expensive spa treatment you'd find in a glossy brochure. For a moment you wonder if you could sneak in a quick shoulder massage, but the stern glare of a priestly supervisor kills that idea instantly. Quirky tidbit for you: some prescriptions involve crocodile dung. Yep. Applied as a paste for certain infections, or, in some cases, used as a very questionable form of birth control. You imagine someone explaining that with a straight face. Yes, smear this reptile poop, you'll be fine. It makes you want to laugh and gag at the same time. You probably won't survive that one, and frankly, either would your dignity. Historians still argue whether these servants genuinely believed in the magical incantations that often accompany treatments, or if those were more for show, ritual words to calm the patient, while the herbs did the real work. Were they healers, or part actors, weaving theater into therapy? The line is as blurry as a sleep-deprived intern's handwriting on a prescription pad. You follow one servant into a cool chamber lined with shelves of jars. He opens one, and the sharp smell of frankincense makes your eyes water. Another jar contains natron, the natural salt used not just in mummification but also in cleansing wounds. Your fingers brush across clay labels scratched with crude hieroglyphs: garlic bulb, poppy sap, coriander. The servant explains that measuring is more. A handful here, a pinch there, than the precise milligrams you demand from your pharmacist. You gulp and decide you won't be their volunteer patient today. A man limps in, holding his arm awkwardly. The servants gather, clean his cut with honey, wrap it tight with linen. One mutters a prayer to Sekhmet, goddess of healing but also of plague, a risky multitasker. Another waves burning incense to purify the air. You watch as the patient relaxes, soothed not just by the treatment but by the ritual itself. There's something oddly modern about it. Medicine plus bedside manner equals comfort. Further along, you pass servants brewing beer, not for partying this time but for medicinal use. Beer mixed with herbs made bitter tonics. One boy carries a jar and grimaces after sipping. It tastes awful. His friend laughs and shouts, "If it tastes bad, it must be working." You grin. Turns out that ancient placebo jokes haven't changed much. Your sandals scrape across a floor dusted with chalky powder, ground limestone used in some pastes. The air vibrates with chanting. A healer is whispering words over a small child's fevered forehead. The mother clutches the child, eyes wide with both fear and hope. The servant mixes poppy with crushed dates, spooning the mixture into the child's mouth. Poppy, yes, that's opium's ancient ancestor. Strong stuff. You silently pray they got the dosage right, otherwise bedtime becomes eternal. In another corner, women massage scented oils into a nobleman's stiff back. His groans of pain slowly turn into sighs of relief. You're reminded that physical therapy, even if not called that, was part of the deal. A servant laughs as the noble snores mid-massage, his face smushed into a cushion of palm leaves. Apparently, snoring aristocrats are timeless. And here's a little scene that sticks with you. One apprentice carefully carves tiny wooden figures of protective gods. These are amulets, slipped under pillows or tied to bandages. Healing was never just about herbs. It was about harnessing divine protection. The servant hums softly as he works, almost like a lullaby, and you can see the way frightened patients clutch those amulets like modern folks grip stress balls. As evening drapes across the temple courtyards, lamps are lit. The herbal smoke curls lazily through the chamber, catching in your throat but leaving you oddly drowsy. The servants keep working, grinding, brewing, chanting, applying. Their invisible hands maintaining the fragile balance between sickness and health, ritual and reality. You lean against the wall, eyelids heavy, watching the rhythm, pestle pounding, chants humming, oil dripping, linen wrapping. The air thickens with incense, sweet and sharp, and for a moment it feels like the temple itself is breathing. And you realize, These forgotten servants weren't just mixing potions or patching wounds. They were keeping Egypt alive, one poultice, one bandage, one whispered spell at a time. The incense haze fades, and soon you're standing beneath a stone lintel carved with falcons and stars. You're not in the herb-scented sick rooms anymore. Instead, you're brushing shoulders with the men and women who track something subtler than fevers or cuts, the sky itself. These are the Star Watchers, the timekeepers, the servants who mapped eternity on papyrus and kept the whole kingdom in rhythm. A servant hunches over a low table, carving lines onto a wooden board. It looks simple at first, just scratches. But when he blows off the dust, you see neat rows of symbols marking days, months, flood cycles. He's creating what you might call a proto-calendar. Mainstream fact here: the Egyptians had a 365-day calendar, divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 extra days tacked on. Pretty close to what you use, minus the whole leap year headache. Your sandals crunch on the sand outside as you follow another servant up onto a flat rooftop. The night is heavy, black velvet pierced with diamond stars. He points to Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. For Egyptians, Sirius rising with the sun marked the annual Nile flood. A celestial alarm clock, basically, but with way more drama. Without that star, farmers wouldn't know when to plant, priests wouldn't know when to bless, and the kingdom's stomachs would stay empty. No pressure, right? Quirky tidbit? The servants sometimes marked hours at night using water clocks, bowls with tiny holes that dripped steadily, measuring time drop by drop. Imagine pulling night duty, half asleep, listening to drip, 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 for hours. You'd start hallucinating ducks, probably. Or maybe invent TikTok just to stay awake. Historians still argue whether the ordinary servants truly understood the astronomical math behind their duties, or if they were more like apprentices repeating motions, filling jars, charting dots, chanting memorized hymns to the stars. Were they proto-scientists, or were they just part of a giant cosmic bureaucracy? You picture them debating in whispers. Do you actually know why we do this? No, but if I stop, the priests will yell. On the ground floor, another servant adjusts a sundial planted in the courtyard. The shadow crawls slowly across carved notches. He mutters under his breath, trying to keep track of which watch of the day it is. You glance at the dial too. It's basically an ancient Fitbit without the step counter. Not quite as glamorous, but the whole empire leaned on it. You trail behind a boy tasked with carrying star maps rolled in papyrus. He's careful, clutching them like sacred treasure, though you catch him doodling in the margins, little stick camels and crude faces. Even star servants needed to blow off steam, apparently. His master scolds him, but you can tell the boy's smirk says, "Hey, nobody's going to see this in 3,000 years. Joke's on him, you just did." Back on the roof, the Star Watchers chant. They lift their arms, tracing invisible lines through constellations. The Milky Way gleams overhead, and they call it the Celestial Nile, mirroring the river below. You tilt your head, and for a dizzy moment it's like the world's turned upside down. One Nile of water, one Nile of stars. One servant kneels by the parapet with a simple tool, just a plumb line dangling from wood. He sights along it, marking where stars rise. Not fancy telescopes, no giant observatories, just patience, rope, and a good eye. You can't help but chuckle. Ancient astronomy, brought to you by Hardware Store String. You notice how all of this, the sundials, the star charts, the dripping bowls, feeds back into real life. Festivals, tax deadlines, temple rituals, planting cycles. Imagine missing payday because someone nodded off while counting water drips. Suddenly your entire paycheck depends on some servant not getting bored at 3 a.m. But for all the tedious math and repetitive chanting, there's magic here too. You lean on the rooftop wall, eyes blurring as stars twinkle. The servants hum low, voices blending with desert wind. For them, each star isn't just a ball of gas but a god's eye, watching. They're caretakers not just of time but of divine order. And then, the sky does something miraculous. Sirius winks at the horizon, pale but clear. The servants cheer quietly, like kids spotting Santa. They rush downstairs, ready to announce to priests that the Nile will soon swell. Tomorrow, farmers will sharpen hoes, families will bless jars, everyone will prepare. All because a servant on a rooftop caught a glimmer of light. You walk down with them, the night still glittering above. Their scrolls rustle, their voices murmur, their sandals slap stone. They're tired, maybe underpaid, maybe underrecognized. Yet they hold the empire's heartbeat in their hands. They're forgotten now, their names erased, but back then, they were the tick-tock of eternity. The stairwell is dim, and your feet echo as you follow the shuffle of servants into a new courtyard. One that smells not of incense or herbs but of dust, ink, and old reed baskets. You've stepped into the world of messengers and scribes' assistants, the people who carried words across the land and made sure Egypt's gossip, official and otherwise, never got lost. You watch a skinny runner adjust the thong of his sandals. His calves are wiry, like someone who's spent his life jogging beside donkeys. He carries a pouch tucked tight against his chest. Inside, a folded scrap of papyrus bearing an order from a nobleman. Move this grain here, tax that farmer there, bring 2 ducks to the feast. It might sound boring, but those scraps kept the machinery of empire grinding along. Without them, the Nile would have been just another river, and Egypt just another dusty kingdom. Mainstream fact, Egypt's scribal class was revered, but they didn't work in isolation. They leaned on countless assistants and runners who made sure messages actually got delivered. One messenger bolts through the courtyard gate, legs pumping as he disappears into the heat shimmer. You imagine trying that job. No air-conditioned office, no Uber, just your own 2 feet, sand in your sandals, and the knowledge that if you trip and lose that papyrus, a noble will chew you out like stale bread. You probably wouldn't survive this gig either, unless you had a serious Gatorade sponsorship. Meanwhile, in the scribe's hall, apprentices squat with sharpened reeds. They're learning to mix ink, soot for black, ochre for red. Quirky tidbit? Red ink was often used for warnings or important names, kind of like ancient Egypt's version of highlighting something in neon yellow. One apprentice doodles a cat in the margin. You laugh. It's proof humanity has always wasted office supplies on bad sketches. A master scribe dictates while an assistant repeats his words out loud, making sure no detail gets mangled. It's like history's first voice-to-text feature, only glitchy. You half expect the assistant to stutter. Delete that, wait, no, I meant 3 goats, not 30. You can feel the master's glare burning holes in him. Historians still argue whether these lower-tier scribal servants were literate in full, or just memorized formulae and symbols. Did they truly read, or were they parrots with pens? The debate lingers, because training a scribe was expensive and time-consuming, and not everyone who held a reed brush had mastered the sacred script. Out in the desert road, you catch up with another courier trudging beside a donkey cart. He's tasked with delivering festival invitations written in elaborate hieratic script. He mutters to himself, practicing the names so he doesn't embarrass himself when handing them over. You picture him like an anxious mailman, rehearsing how to pronounce the pharaoh's cousin's cousin's cousin. No pressure. In another corner, 2 messengers rest under a palm. They compare scars from sandstorms, one pulling his tunic aside to reveal a nasty scrape. Courier life. He shrugs. At least it's not tomb duty. They laugh, sip stale beer from a jar, and go back to running the Empire's postal service with 0 Wi-Fi and a lot of calluses. You kneel beside a pile of discarded papyrus shavings. The smell of ink and reed dust clings to your fingers. Imagine the monotony, sharpening pens all day, cleaning up spills, replacing cracked ink palettes. And yet, in those scraps lie fragments of life, complaints about lazy workers, shopping lists for figs, tiny prayers scribbled in the margins. Forgotten servants, immortal whispers. One apprentice rushes past carrying a sealed letter for a noblewoman. The wax seal glistens, marked with a scarab. He nearly drops it, then hugs it tighter like it's a newborn. You joke under your breath. That's express delivery, no tracking number included. At dusk, the scribal assistants gather to copy practice texts. Their candles flicker. They scratch out. Writing is the path to eternity. Over and over. One yawns so wide you think his jaw might unhinge. The irony isn't lost. He's writing about immortality while barely staying awake. And so you sit among them, the runners, the assistants, the apprentices who never made it into marble statues or golden tombs. Their job was to carry words, sometimes sacred hymns, sometimes grocery lists. Without them, voices would have died in the dust. Tonight they still murmur, papyrus rustling, sandals slapping, ink pots clinking like faint echoes down the centuries. The night cools, and you trail after the fading clatter of sandals into a different space, a courtyard humming not with scribes or healers, but with the clang of bronze and the thump of wooden mallets. This is where the temple's maintenance crew lives, the unsung mechanics of eternity. These servants kept the sacred places shining and functional, and without them, all the incense and chanting would have been staged inside a crumbling, leaky ruin. You lean against the limestone wall, watching two workers polish a statue of Osiris. They scrape off bird droppings with solemn care. Not exactly glamorous, right? But for them, this is holy work. If the god's image cracked or got grimy, it could spell bad omens. One mainstream fact: temples weren't just spiritual hubs. They were economic centers, holding land, wealth, and power. Keeping them pristine was both a religious and political duty. Nearby, a team balances on ladders, patching faded hieroglyphs with fresh pigment. Their hands tremble as they mix blue pigment from ground lapis. That stone was imported from Afghanistan. Talk about a supply chain flex. Quirky tidbit? Blue was so prized that it was sometimes nicknamed divine hair color, thought to mirror the heavens. You can't help but smirk at the thought of a maintenance worker essentially doing a touch-up job on a god's hairline. A water boy trudges in, arms wobbling under the weight of a jar. The workers cheer when he arrives. They chug like modern construction guys downing energy drinks. Except theirs is watered beer, lukewarm and foamy. You wonder how many temple columns were painted a little crooked because someone was on their third beer before noon. Behind the main hall, another group mixes plaster to fill cracks in a relief. Dust clouds hang in the air. One worker sneezes so hard he nearly topples into the bucket. You joke softly. Imagine telling your boss you defaced a temple wall because of hay fever. His foreman doesn't look amused. Historians still argue whether these crews were permanent staff on temple payroll or hired seasonally for big festivals and renovations. Some evidence suggests full-time servants lived on temple grounds, while others may have been villagers drafted into holy house repairs when the need arose. Either way, their fingerprints, literally, remain pressed into the dried plaster of sacred walls. Farther in, you spot a man greasing the hinges of a colossal wooden door. He hums as he works, sweat dripping into the oil jar. Without him, the priest's grand processions would have been stuck at squeaky doors, an awkward soundtrack for divine majesty. His friend teases, "Careful, the god might not like squeaks." You grin. Even back then, sarcasm was a universal coping tool. And then there are the floor sweepers, endlessly brushing sand from stone. The desert was always intruding, sneaking in with every gust. One woman sweeps with rhythmic strokes, almost like she's keeping beat for a song only she hears. You picture her rolling her eyes at the priests while thinking, "Sure, I'll sweep the desert." Again. The futility feels familiar, like trying to keep crumbs out of your keyboard. At the temple roofline, a team wrestles ropes, lowering baskets of fresh tiles. The sun hits their backs so hard it feels like the gods themselves are testing their stamina. You imagine climbing up there, sweaty palms, sandals slipping, only to be told you placed a tile slightly crooked. You'd quit halfway through and become a papyrus doodler instead. Evenings bring quiet but no rest. You hear the scrape of bronze tools as lamps are refilled and soot wiped from walls. The faint glow makes shadows dance like spirits. Maintenance never ended. Sacred spaces demanded a 24/7 commitment. One apprentice groans, "Didn't I just clean this yesterday?" His elder pats his shoulder. The gods notice. You chuckle. Sounds exactly like a parent telling you to redo chores because visitors might come. As you wander deeper, you catch sight of a small chamber. Broken tools piled neatly, chisels dulled, brushes frayed. It looks like a graveyard of effort. You reach down and hold a chipped brush. The bristles are stiff with old pigment. Once, it touched a god's image. Now it's forgotten junk. You can't help thinking, maybe that's the real theme of temple servants, sacred work fading into dust. The courtyard winds down. Workers stretch aching backs, leaning against walls streaked with paint and sweat. They talk about their families, their gardens, their gossip. A joke passes. The gods may live forever, but my back won't. You smile, knowing that even in a world of gods, the most human thing remained, complaining after a long shift. And as the temple shadows lengthen, you feel the unspoken truth. All the grandeur, the incense, the pageantry, depended not on priests in golden robes but on servants with brushes, ladders, oils, and brooms. Without them, eternity would have been shabby indeed. The desert stars stretch above you like pinpricks of silver, and yet your attention stays fixed closer to the ground, on the shuffling of feet, the creak of carts, and the groan of ropes pulled taut. You've wandered into the ranks of royal baggage carriers, the human logistics system behind Egypt's grand journeys. Pharaohs might ride in gilded barges, nobles might glide in chariots, but someone still had to haul the endless piles of linen, food, makeup boxes, and sacred tchotchkes across scorching sands. That someone is now shuffling past you with a look that screams, "I didn't sign up for this." They hoist trunks carved with hieroglyphs, each one heavier than your weekend suitcase stuffed with, just in case, outfits. A mainstream fact: expeditions to quarries, military campaigns, or royal pilgrimages demanded hundreds of carriers, each assigned to bundles that could weigh half their body. Donkeys and oxen helped, but in the rough terrain of wadis and temples, the final lift always came down to sweating humans. You marvel at the sheer logistics. Egypt, in many ways, ran on shoulders. One quirky tidbit? Ancient baggage sometimes included jars of honey sealed tight, a favorite travel sweetener. There are records of honey being so treasured that soldiers guarded it like gold. Picture it, a weary servant trudging with honey jars, muttering, "If I drop this, the general's breakfast toast is ruined." You almost laugh out loud at the thought. As the caravan lumbers forward, you catch sight of one poor guy wobbling under a caged goose, wings flapping wildly. The bird honks so loudly you're sure it's announcing every step. The man scowls, and you can almost hear him thinking, "I trained my whole life to be reduced to goose uber?" You whisper encouragement, but let's be honest, you'd have traded him spots only for about 5 seconds. At a rest stop near a cluster of acacias, the carriers slump down, backs raw, palms blistered. A few pull out scraps of bread dipped in watered beer. One man jokes that his load probably weighs more than the scribe riding comfortably on a donkey ahead. Everyone chuckles, that universal humor of workers ribbing the boss who's not lifting a finger. Historians still argue whether these baggage carriers were permanent retainers of wealthy households or drafted peasants pressed into duty for the king's campaigns. In some records, they're rewarded with food rations and occasionally a bit of leftover loot. In others, they seem like temporary laborers, forgotten once the caravan disbanded. Either way, their footprints paved the roads to Egypt's glory. The caravan resumes. The night air cools, but straps still bite into shoulders. You notice how each servant has a trick. One shifts the weight constantly, another hums to distract himself, another wraps padding under the rope to keep skin from tearing. It's a choreography of survival. You try lifting one basket yourself. Bad idea. You nearly topple into the sand, and the carrier beside you snorts. Stick to storytelling. Fair. Sometimes, when the pharaoh himself traveled, carriers bore not just baggage but portable shrines, miniature altars, and statues of gods. Imagine lugging a stone falcon in 100-degree heat because the divine needed a change of scenery. One servant mutters, "The gods lighter in my prayers." You grin. That's the kind of sarcastic faith that deserves respect. As dawn breaks, you glimpse the camp being set. The baggage team doesn't rest yet. They unload, unroll mats, stack jars, prepare cooking pots. By the time the nobles wander over asking, "Where's my linen sheet?" The servants have already been awake for 20 hours. You can practically hear them biting their tongues to keep from snapping. Check the linen pile, Your Highness. A boy runs past carrying a perfume jar. He trips, the jar wobbles, and you hold your breath. Somehow, miraculously, it doesn't smash. Everyone bursts into relieved laughter, though the boy's wide eyes suggest he's already picturing himself feeding crocodiles if he had dropped it. You whisper, "Kid, you'll be telling that story for years." There's also the more solemn cargo, funerary goods, carefully packed to accompany nobles or royalty on journeys to burial sites. Carriers had to balance reverence with brute strength, moving coffins and treasure without so much as a scratch. One wrong move, and you weren't just clumsy, you risked angering both the family and the gods. No pressure, right? As the caravan fades into the horizon, you're left with the echo of tired jokes, the squeak of wooden wheels, and the unspoken truth that Egypt's grandeur, its conquests, its ceremonies, its trade, was always carried on the backs of people who rarely saw their names carved in stone. Their labor made pharaohs look effortless, but the sweat behind the sparkle was very real. The sweet scent of freshly kneaded dough drifts toward you long before you spot its source. You wander into a small courtyard tucked behind high mud brick walls, where a team of royal bread makers kneels in the dust, their arms deep in troughs of sticky flour. Welcome to the hidden bakery of the palace, the beating stomach of ancient Egypt. Nobles could fast if they wanted piety, but servants? They had to keep the ovens burning day and night, turning grain into loaves that fed everyone from priests to guards to royal pets. And now you, lucky wanderer, get to slip into the flour-stained chaos. A mainstream fact, bread was the staple of Egypt. Archaeologists have found countless bread molds and oven remains, proving this was more than food, it was life itself. Without bread, even pharaohs would have been left grumpy and mortal. And while many households baked, the palace demanded an army of bakers to keep its massive staff running. Imagine your workplace cafeteria, then multiply it by the size of a kingdom. You watch one baker pound barley flour with water, while another sprinkles coriander seeds on top for flavor. A third carefully adds dates into a batch destined for the royal table. Suddenly you realize you're basically standing in line at Egypt's first bakery chain. Only here, the brand loyalty is enforced by divine decree. No customer complaints allowed unless you enjoy crocodile ponds. A quirky tidbit: some breads were shaped into tiny animals, meant as offerings to the gods. A worker proudly shows off a turtle-shaped loaf, though it looks suspiciously like a lumpy sandal. You smile politely. Honestly, you'd still eat it, maybe with a dab of honey. The ovens roar, fueled by dried dung bricks. The air grows stifling, flour dust clings to your throat, and you wonder how these bakers aren't fainting. One pauses, wiping his forehead, then mutters a joke about how he dreams of being reborn as a fish, so at least I'd stay cool. Everyone chuckles, even as they slap another loaf into the heat. Over in the corner, a scribe records how many loaves are baked. He scolds one servant for dropping dough in the sand. "That counts as waste," he barks. The servant mutters back, "Maybe the gods like crunchy bread." You almost laugh out loud. Surely divine jaws could handle a little grit. Historians still argue whether bread baked for nobles really was as fine and clean as inscriptions claim, or if everyone tolerated a bit of sand as added texture. Nearby, you spot a worker carefully fermenting beer, because bread and beer were twin pillars of sustenance. Sometimes stale loaves were even dunked into jars to brew the drink. You can't help but marvel that ancient bakers basically doubled as bartenders, the unsung heroes of morale. You imagine one worker whispering, "2 loaves, 1 beer, happy pharaoh," like a secret recipe to keep the kingdom from collapse. As the morning rush crescendos, the bakers shout to each other, sliding loaves from ovens, stacking them in reed baskets. A boy rushes in to deliver bread to the temple priests. Another hauls a tray toward the kitchens for the queen's breakfast. One loaf cracks open, steaming soft inside. You inhale deeply, and your stomach growls in betrayal. The head baker notices and teases. "Careful, smell too much, you owe us labor." You back up quickly. During festivals, the workload multiplied. Caravans demanded bread for soldiers, feasts demanded mounds of sweetened loaves, and gods demanded offerings in absurd quantities. Some records describe hundreds of loaves baked for a single ceremony. You imagine a baker sighing, "The god of the sun better not skip breakfast after this." Night falls, but the ovens still glow, red embers pulsing like the heartbeat of the palace. Servants knead by moonlight, their hands moving on instinct. They don't get applause, only blisters and the faint satisfaction of knowing their work keeps the empire upright. The bread you nibble today may be forgotten tomorrow, but for one moment in the courtyard, surrounded by heat and laughter, you know you've touched the very core of Egypt's survival. The glow of embers fades behind you, and you follow the faint thud of stone against stone, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat muffled under the desert night. Soon you stumble into a long chamber where sparks dance off chisels, and the air smells of wet clay mixed with scorched copper. Welcome to the world of ancient Egyptian toolmakers, the quiet engineers whose hands shaped the very instruments that built temples, carved statues, and scraped bread dough from ovens. Without them, Pharaoh's pyramids would still be blueprints in sand. You crouch near a craftsman hunched over a small block of copper. His hammer rises and falls, each strike bending the metal a fraction. Sweat gleams on his back, but his hands move with practiced calm. He looks up, grins, and says, "Give me enough time, and I'll turn this into a god's smile." You don't doubt it. A mainstream fact here, Egyptian toolmakers shifted the course of history by moving from stone to copper, and later to bronze, giving their civilization an edge in farming, building, and warfare. Imagine trying to carve hieroglyphs with a rock. It works, but slowly. With copper chisels? Suddenly temples rise faster, and pharaohs feel smug. Nearby, another worker grinds a rough stone into a smoother blade. He dips it in water, squints, and tests it against wood. Sparks pop like tiny fireworks, illuminating his tired eyes. A boy sits at his feet, fanning the fire to keep the coals glowing. His arm looks sore, but he dares not stop. The fire is the heartbeat of the workshop. Without it, metal stiffens into useless lumps. A quirky tidbit: some chisels were deliberately left dull because they were used only for ritual carvings, not practical work. So yes, imagine bragging about your divine hammer that can barely chip paint. It's like owning an expensive kitchen knife that never touches vegetables. Status over function. You drift deeper inside, where racks of reed baskets hold awls, adzes, needles, and mysterious little contraptions. A toolmaker hands you a drill, 2 sticks bound with a twisted string. He spins it with a flourish, boring a hole into a bit of limestone. You blink at the speed, realizing it's basically a hand-powered power tool. He chuckles. Good enough for Pharaoh. Good enough for you. And here's where scholars get fussy. Historians still argue whether Egyptian artisans used bronze saws with sand abrasives to cut massive stone blocks, or whether brute manpower did most of the work. You picture a group of archaeologists in khakis, waving rulers, shouting, "Bronze could never handle granite," while an ancient craftsman smirks in the afterlife, muttering, "Worked just fine when I did it." Over in the shadows, women thread copper needles with linen, forging tools not for temples but for clothes. You watch one stitch a piece of cloth while humming a lullaby, multitasking like a modern seamstress balancing Spotify and deadlines. Another toolmaker sharpens knives for butchers, who need clean cuts to keep meat safe. Every servant depends on these unseen engineers. Your ears pick up a sarcastic voice. Of course the nobles think the gods gave them pyramids fully formed. Guess they've never swung a hammer at dawn. Laughter ripples through the workshop. Even here, humor survives, call it stress relief by sarcasm. One worker pulls out a mold shaped like a chisel blade. He fills it with molten copper, glowing bright like a captured sun. The room flickers red. Everyone leans back slightly, out of respect for the liquid fire. You imagine dropping one bead on your toe. You probably wouldn't survive that. When the mold cools, the craftsman cracks it open to reveal a fresh tool, raw and sharp. There's a collective sigh, as though a newborn has just entered the world. Festivals mean rush orders. Priests demand polished knives for sacrifices, soldiers beg for spearheads, and farmers need sickles sharp enough to harvest grain before floods. The toolmakers groan, but they deliver. After all, a dull blade equals famine, and nobody wants to anger both gods and humans in the same season. At night, when fires dim, they hang tools on pegs, whispering small prayers to Ta, patron of craftsmen. Some rub ash on their foreheads, believing it wards off burns. A few sneak jokes. If Ta is really watching, maybe he'll give us air conditioning. You can almost hear their tired laughter drift beyond the walls. You leave the workshop with ringing ears, a faint smell of copper stuck in your nose, and an odd respect for these servants. They may never see their names etched on monuments, but every chisel mark on every obelisk is their silent autograph. You'll never look at a hammer the same way again. You follow a trail of fine white dust that glimmers under the torchlight, coating the floor like desert snow. The air grows sharp, almost sweet, and soon your tongue feels dry, as though you've been chewing chalk. You've stumbled into the realm of ancient Egyptian perfume makers and healers, servants who dealt not in stone or copper, but in aromas, oils, and potions. Here, life and death were disguised in fragrance. A row of small clay jars sits neatly on a reed mat. One lid lifts, and suddenly you're inhaling frankincense, sharp and piney, a smell that feels wholly even to your tired lungs. Another jar reveals lotus oil, soft and floral, drifting you toward drowsiness. Then comes myrrh, thicker, heavier, a scent with the persistence of an unwelcome guest. You sneeze, and a perfumer grins. That means the spirits noticed you. Comforting? Maybe not. A mainstream fact: Egyptians were among the earliest to create complex perfumes, blending oils from plants, resins, and even animal fats. Perfume wasn't just luxury, it was medicine, deodorant, bug repellent, and a ticket to divine favor. Basically, it was their version of all-in-one shampoo, conditioner, body wash, and car wax. One healer crushes green malachite powder with honey, stirring it into a paste. He claims it protects eyes from infection and glare. You squint skeptically, but then recall how many tomb paintings show servants with green eyelids. Not fashion, it was medical science. Another worker ties garlic bulbs with string, swearing the smell scares away evil spirits. Honestly, it probably scared away humans too. The quirkier side? Perfume makers sometimes experimented with crocodile dung mixed into concoctions. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine your neighbors spritzing themselves with eau de now croc. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic, medicinal, or just a prank on gullible nobles. Either way, you're suddenly grateful for modern deodorant. One servant holds a shallow dish over glowing coals. Resin melts into smoke, curling like ghostly fingers toward the ceiling. He waves it gently, murmuring to invisible forces. The smell is intoxicating. You almost forget the heat pressing against your skin. He says it keeps away demons that sneak into dreams. You can't decide if that's superstition or an early version of aromatherapy. Maybe both. In a corner, women pound rose petals, blending them into thick pastes. One dips her finger, touches it to her lips, and smiles knowingly. Lip gloss, 1500 BC edition. Another rubs oil into her arms, shining like polished bronze. She says it keeps her skin from cracking in the desert sun. Sunscreen before coppertone. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier? At least rose oil smells better. Here's where scholarly debates heat up. Historians still argue whether Egyptians actually distilled fragrances, like later perfumers did, or if they simply pressed and boiled ingredients. No distillation equipment has been found, but that doesn't stop some researchers from insisting ancient labs once existed, filled with gurgling glass. Imagine Indiana Jones with a scented candle collection. A healer approaches you with a clay cup filled with thick, bitter liquid. For your stomach, he says. You eye it like it's a medieval smoothie. He insists it's fermented barley with herbs, good for cramps, bad for taste buds. You sip, gag, and force a smile. He nods approvingly, like you've passed some strange test. Congratulations, you've just sampled Egyptian Pepto-Bismol. Perfume wasn't just personal, it marked status. Priests drenched themselves in sacred oils during rituals. Nobles competed over who smelled most divine. Workers, meanwhile, got the leftovers, smearing whatever scraps remained. You picture a construction crew today fighting over who gets the last squirt of cologne in a bottle. Some things never change. The healers whisper to one another about dreams, omens, and body aches. One scribbles tiny hieroglyphs on a scrap of papyrus, a prescription of sorts. He tucks it in your palm, saying, "Burn this under your bed, and the fever will pass." You're not sure whether to laugh or worry. By nightfall, the room smells like 1,000 gardens and funerals combined. The servants close jars carefully, as though each fragrance were alive. Some pray softly, asking the gods to bless their mixtures. Others simply stretch their aching backs, muttering about tomorrow's endless pounding of petals and resins. You leave the chamber dizzy, your nose overwhelmed, your head light. Perfume here isn't just a luxury, it's survival, status, and sacredness wrapped into one invisible veil. You step outside, and for the first time, the desert air feels dull, almost empty, without the ghostly swirl of lotus, frankincense, and myrrh. You shuffle deeper into the palace complex, where the air feels thick with anticipation, as though the walls themselves hold their breath. Torches flicker low, revealing a courtyard alive with movement. This is the hidden domain of ceremonial servants, those whose entire existence revolves around staging rituals that blur the line between theater and magic. You've wandered into Egypt's backstage crew, priest assistants, dancers, torch-bearers, and even professional mourners, each with a role so specific that forgetting a gesture could accidentally offend a god. No pressure. The first thing you notice is the clatter of sistrums, metal rattles shaped like temple doorways. Servants sway with hypnotic rhythm, shaking them in unison. The sound, metallic yet soothing, was believed to chase away chaos. A mainstream fact, Isis, the goddess of motherhood, was often depicted holding a sistrum, and ritual attendants used the instrument to summon her presence. You can't help but imagine it as an ancient Egyptian baby rattle, though saying that aloud here might get you cursed. Torches flare as boys with shaved heads and kohl-rimmed eyes run past, balancing fire like Olympic sprinters. Their job is simple: keep flames alive during ceremonies, no matter what. They dodge, kneel, and relight lamps with the precision of stagehands on opening night. You wonder if they ever dropped a torch and set someone's wig ablaze. Historians still argue whether torchbearers also doubled as guards, or if their sole duty was light management. Either way, you realize electricity has spoiled you. A group of women steps forward, their hair loose, their robes torn dramatically at the chest. They wail in perfect harmony, their cries high and sharp, echoing through the courtyard. These are the professional mourners. They rehearse grief the way singers rehearse scales. In funerals for nobles, they performed this display so convincingly that even strangers would break down sobbing. It's essentially Broadway tragedy, with extra eyeliner. The quirky part? Some mourners actually tattooed names of the dead on their arms, carrying grief like a permanent costume piece. In a shadowy corner, dancers spin in tight circles, bodies bending low to the earth, then springing upright like startled cats. Their feet pound dust into clouds that shimmer in torchlight. One performer smears blue pigment across her face, claiming it wards off spirits jealous of the ritual. Another fastens a crocodile tooth to her ankle, clinking with each step. You suddenly realize these details aren't random, they're carefully coded symbols. Egypt didn't do casual Fridays. Near the temple gates, servants carry trays piled with bread, meat, and beer, setting them down with dramatic precision. These offerings aren't for human mouths but for gods, spirits, and the occasional lucky cat. You watch as one man adjusts a goose so its head points east, apparently the proper divine dining etiquette. Imagine being paid to align poultry for eternity. Historians still debate whether servants ate leftovers after rituals or if consuming them was taboo. Personally, you hope someone got to taste the bread. Wasting carbs feels criminal. One servant approaches with a painted mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. He fits it over his face, instantly transforming into something between sacred priest and horror film extra. His task, escorting spirits through ritual performance. You shiver, then remind yourself it's mostly symbolic. Mostly. The quirkier rituals verge on surreal. Some servants carried miniature boats, filled with incense, sailing them across temple pools to reenact the gods' journeys. Others climbed scaffolds to drop flower petals onto statues, a divine shower of blossoms. One record even describes attendants dressing as baboons to imitate Thoth's animal form. Yes, imagine rehearsing that costume role. You wonder if some poor servant ever got stuck braying mid-ceremony. But beneath the theatricality lies exhaustion. Servants rehearse chants until their voices crack, polish ceremonial vessels until they blind under torchlight, and practice timing incense plumes with hymns. Their mistakes weren't shrugged off, they risked blame for offending gods or, worse, angering the pharaoh. Forget stage fright. Here it's cosmic fright. And yet there's beauty. Imagine standing in a courtyard filled with drums, rattles, wails, and chants merging into one overwhelming soundscape. Smoke rises, stars glimmer above, statues loom, and every gesture feels choreographed with eternity in mind. You, standing at the edge, feel tiny yet included, a witness to the forgotten stage crew of the divine. As the final chant fades, servants collapse against walls, sipping leftover beer, wiping sweat from painted faces. Their sacred roles complete, they return to being tired workers, laughing quietly about mistakes no priest noticed. One boy mimics a mourner's wail, and everyone snickers. Even God's stagehands needed comic relief. Now your long journey across the hidden professions of Egypt's servants draws to its close. You've wandered from laundry rooms to tomb shafts, from perfume workshops to torchlit courtyards, uncovering layers of human effort buried under Pharaoh's glory. These forgotten figures scrubbed, sang, stitched, and sweated, their lives bound to rituals and duties most history books leave in footnotes. And you've been their guest, trudging in second-hand sandals through centuries of overlooked labor. And now, as the torches dim and the last echoes of chanting fade into the desert night, you let yourself exhale slowly, like a sailboat finally gliding into still waters. The air feels softer here, lighter, stripped of smoke and dust. Even the stone walls seem to lean back, no longer pulsing with ritual urgency but sinking into silence, into rest. You imagine lying down on a cool reed mat, the faint trace of lotus still clinging to the air, the hush of distant Nile waters carrying your thoughts gently downstream. The servants you met today, whether pounding linen against stone, painting tiny hieroglyphs, or rattling sistrums in perfect rhythm, drift away like silhouettes in fading torchlight. Their voices soften, their tasks dissolve, until they are simply shadows blending into the warm night. Every inhale you take is slower than the last, and every exhale carries a little more weight away from your shoulders. The clamor of rituals, the clatter of tools, the laughter and whispers, all dim until you're left with a hush so deep it feels like a blanket. You remind yourself that tomorrow is distant, that the world outside your room can wait, and that tonight is for slipping into a rhythm as old as the Nile's flow. So you close your eyes, letting your body grow heavier, imagining stars wheeling overhead, eternal and calm. The servants of Egypt, long forgotten, have done their part. And you, for now, need do nothing but rest. Let sleep come gently, like sand sifting through fingers, steady and unhurried, until the last thought is carried off like incense smoke on a night breeze.